The bell of Magdalen tolled just as the record began to slip into the Largo. A kind of coincidence, perhaps, but one that felt less random than arranged, as though Mahler and the chapel had conspired to bruise the evening at precisely the same moment. I sat in the armchair by the window, the autumn sky a bruised plum beyond the glass, and let the sound settle behind my eyes. I had, earlier that afternoon, wandered into one of those second-hand bookshops that seem to appear when needed and vanish thereafter, the kind with the smell of damp vellum and slightly embarrassed shopkeepers. I'd left with an early edition of selected poets of the 16th century, nothing rare, nothing especially valuable, except perhaps to those of us with a tendency toward the already lost. Inside the front cover, in a lean, confident hand, someone had written, "To write your name is to let you live again." It was unsigned, pencil, faintly smudged. I read it twice, then a third time, the way one listens again to a piece of music, because they can't quite tell if it's beautiful or simply familiar. There was something unfinished about the sentiment, as though the writing of the name had not, in the end, achieved its purpose. The whiskey was Talisker, 3 fingers, no ice. The hangover was from something cheaper the night before, a departmental dinner, I believe, though I confess the details fled me. Lewis had driven me home, which meant he'd seen me at something less than my best. He never mentioned it. That's his way. One of the few virtues I've never been able to counterfeit. I had just lifted the record arm to play the Largo again, when the phone rang. Its sound had the abruptness of something outside time, like hearing one's own name in a dream. Lewis's voice, softened by static, met me with the careful gentleness he employed only when death was involved. A guest house on Holywell Street. Room 12, door locked, blind drawn, no answer for over a day. The maid had assumed the guest had gone early, left without paying, but the bed was untouched. A faint smell of something metallic, the bath still full. He paused, perhaps expecting something from me, but I only listened. The name in the guest book, he said, was Catherine Finch. I don't know why it struck me. There are, after all, many Catherines in the world, but I repeated it under my breath. Finch, and again I felt that dislocated sensation, as though something was being remembered by a part of me I had not consciously visited in years. The guest house was one I'd passed often but never entered. Red brick, with ivy climbing it in that determined, slow-motion way of old academic buildings, the kind of place for widows visiting from Hampshire, or lecturers passing through. The smell inside was beeswax and radiator rust. A woman in her 50s with prematurely white hair met us, biting a fingernail. Her name escapes me. Most do. She'd knocked that morning. Then again in the afternoon, she'd heard the bath water running. Still running, even when Lewis and the constable forced the door. I remember only fragments from the room. A blue towel on the floor, a razor left uncapped on the sink. One of those soaps you get from college kitchens, the kind that smells like nostalgia and chlorine. Her body had been clean, unnaturally so. No clothes visible, the window cracked open, though the night had been cold. No note, no handbag, just a volume of poetry beside the bed. Les Amours de Cassandre, French verse, gently thumbed, spine unbroken. I found the scorched paper in the waste bin. Only the corner remained, but it was enough. The edge of a word, half-inked. I would later try to match it to the handwriting in the novel I'd bought, and fail. I stood in that narrow bathroom, watching the water swirl, a strand of hair drifting lazily near the drain, and thought of the line in the book, "To write your name is to let you live again." She had written someone's name, I was certain. The question was, whose? There is, in every truly quiet room, a peculiar tension, not absence, precisely, but the suggestion of something withheld. The woman's room at the Holywell guest house had this quality. Not just tidy, not merely bare, but arranged, carefully, deliberately. A silence that had been built, not fallen into. The bed was untouched. A square depression in the cushion by the window suggested she had sat there, possibly for hours, without moving. The curtains had been drawn to a precise symmetry, The bath drained now, though its phantom remained in the fine damp of the air. The wastebasket had been emptied, then replaced almost. A single scrap of burnt paper, wedged beneath the bin's rim, had resisted the cleaner's efforts. I lifted it with tweezers, though it weighed nothing. The edges were scorched, the center blank. Only a crescent of ink, a downward stroke, and a sharp horizontal part of a name, perhaps. Part of a thought she chose not to leave behind. Beside it, the pen. Gold-nibbed, modest, bone-dry. Lewis, ever the necessary voice of the procedural, confirmed what we already knew. No passport, no handbag, no makeup, no address, no toothbrush, no mobile phone. Just a woman in her late 30s, dark-haired, slim, with no scars but for one faint line along the heel of her left hand. Not self-inflicted, not surgical. Something older. The poetry book, Les Amours de Cassandre, remained on the nightstand, a small, antiquated edition. The kind of thing a romantic might carry or a fraud might stage. French verses that once undid kings, now unrid, and like her unclaimed. Back at the station, the coroner called. No signs of trauma, no bruising, no forced entry, no water in the lungs. Death likely from a sedative, some hours before the bath. Cold, clean, quiet. He sounded almost admiring, and I couldn't quite blame him. There are deaths one feels the dead had rehearsed. Then the letter arrived. Unmarked envelope, ivory paper, no return address. She was never meant to die here. That was all. Postmarked Oxford. Lewis suggested a hoax, or some morbid game, and perhaps it was. But there was something in the phrasing, not anger, not guilt, a kind of regret, perhaps, or accusation. I stared again at the guestbook. The signature, Catherine Finch, slanted downward as if in retreat. It was, I suspected, a borrowed name. The poetry book, slim, foxed, quietly defiant in its survival, bore a Western Library sticker, bullion issue. The serial number led us back to the lending ledger, where the slip was still intact, initialed with 3 familiar loops. Dr. Laura Bexley. That name I did know. She had been a junior fellow when I first heard it. A lecturer in early French verse, with a reputation for precision and a particular kind of self-containment. Men admired her, but not easily. There was something in her manner, gracious, amused, distant, that kept all affection at a scholarly remove. I had once heard her speak on the politics of Petrarch and form in post-Reformation England, and remember only that she had made the word yearning sound like a calculated thesis. And now the dead woman, whoever she was, had taken out Bexley's borrowed book, read it perhaps, and died with it by her side. The silence of the guest room returned to me as I walked beneath the arches of the Bodleian Quad, the kind of silence that exists not from absence but from arrangement. Not an accident, a decision, made by someone who understood how quiet can speak louder than grief. It struck me then. The pen had been dry, but not dusty. Someone had attempted to write, or had, and destroyed it, which meant the silence had not been her first instinct, but her final one. And silence, I've always found, is only rarely innocent. The porter at St. Hilda's regarded me with a blend of suspicion and reverence, as though I were a figure from a half-remembered cautionary tale. The quad was silent, the gravel barely shifting beneath my step, gardens precisely indifferent. Everything here, it seemed, preferred its own company. Dr. Laura Bexley's rooms were on the 2nd floor, just above the library. The staircase smelled of varnish and old radiators. A faint echo accompanied each ascent, as if the building were uncertain of your right to be there. She received me without surprise, which always unsettles me. A tall woman, not young, but spared the indignities of time, by an angular elegance that suggested discipline, not luck. Her voice had the cadence of someone who had spent many years listening to herself speak in lecture halls. She offered tea, which I declined, offered again. This time more coolly, I declined again. There is a threshold beyond which hospitality becomes theatrical, and I've never liked being an audience. I asked about the book, Les Amours de Cassandre. She said she'd lent it to a student 2 terms ago, couldn't remember who. Perhaps someone researching French sonnet forms. The name Catherine Finch? No, she said, crisply, definitively. I've never taught anyone by that name. Her study was as curated as her manner. Books alphabetized in languages other than English. A stack of lecture notes, bound with ribbon, and there, on the desk, framed in pewter, a photograph. 2 women on a coastal path, wind hugging at their coats. One was clearly Bexley, younger but recognizably arranged. The other, though her hair was longer and her face sun-warmed, was the woman from the guest house, or someone very like her. When I gestured toward it, Bexley glanced briefly, then looked away. That, goodness, years ago, possibly Devon, or Brittany. She couldn't recall. I asked the woman's name. She hesitated, not enough for someone feigning memory, but just long enough for someone deciding how much to misplace. A friend, she said. Frances. Or was it Fiona? She honestly couldn't say. When I asked about the Holywell guest house, her breath paused just slightly before the exhale. She said she hadn't been there in years. I hadn't told her where the body had been found. She stood then, which I took to mean the interview was over. It was a well-executed maneuver, conveying authority without threat. I thanked her, and left, my gaze brushing once more across the photograph as I did. 2 women, smiling not with affection, but with something more conspiratorial. Back at the station, Lewis had something. He handed me a photocopy, smug in his quiet way. An article from the Bastion Review, a poetry journal long since defunct, dated 1987. Author, Catherine Finch. The poem was overwrought, collegiate, but not without merit. Something about unwritten letters and salt on the spine of envelopes. But the byline struck me most. The name had weight, a kind of performative sadness. Editor's note at the bottom, submitted by recommendation of Dr. Ian Merrow, Balliol College. Merrow. That was a name with dust on it. I remembered a photograph of him, years ago, in the Cherwell tweed. Tobacco-stained teeth. A smile that almost apologized for itself. He had disappeared from the university circuit not long after a scandal, a student suicide, poorly handled, perhaps encouraged by negligence dressed up as rigor. Merrow had always been one of those men who believed youth should hurt a little to learn. I sat with the journal in my lap, reading the poem again, slower this time. To write is to live again, it said at one point. Not the same wording as the book inscription, but close enough to tremble beside it. Catherine Finch was, I was beginning to suspect, less a person than a story. And stories, I've learned, are often more dangerous than people. It was just after 7 when I took the crossword from the bottom of the pile. The Times, 3 days old, edges curled like forgotten letters. I never start with the first clue. I've always preferred the middle, where meanings drift rather than declare. 13 across, lover once denied, voice 7. I lingered. I always do, with clues that pretend simplicity. There was something theatrical in the phrasing, the way it bent around suggestion. Lover, silenced, denied voice. 7 letters. It came to me, not all at once, but with the soft inevitability of dusk. Silence. Not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of what had been withheld. I circled the word once, then set the paper aside. Back at the guest house, the air still tasted faintly of antiseptic and old pipwork. The room was just as we'd left it, police tape half lifted, the smell of something floral and artificial lingering in the curtains. I sat in the same chair she must have occupied, the spine of Les Amours de Cassandre creaking in my hand. The inscription again, to write your name is to let you live again, attributed, beneath the words, to Ronsard. But Ronsard never wrote that. Not in French, nor translation. I was certain. I returned to the station and pulled the Oxford Companion to Minor English Verse from the shelf behind my desk. A book untouched by anyone but me. Its pages annotated with questions I no longer remembered asking. There it was. Page 24th one. Harold Amble, poet, 1912 and 1963. Obscure, obliquely celebrated, composed primarily in private pamphlets, limited editions and the margins of other men's books. To write your name is to let you live again. Line 4. Elegy for an unwritten letter. Amble, not Ronsard. The misattribution, then, had been deliberate or careless. Either way, it was a fingerprint. His archive was held at the Western Library, sealed until recently due to some dispute with an heir who lived, I believe, in Belgium. The librarian, a young man with ink beneath his fingernails and an apologetic cough, led me to the reading room with the reverence of someone introducing a cathedral. The box was plain, but inside, chaos made flesh. Letters with folded corners, typed fragments pinned to personal notes, sketches of women whose names were forgotten. But there, midway through a folder labeled Uncollected Verse, I found the poem again. Same title, same line. Beneath it a footnote scribbled in the poet's own hand. For C.F. who wrote only once, but always truly. C.F. Catherine Finch, or Frances, or Fiona, or none of the above. I asked the librarian if anyone had requested the archive recently. He nodded, hesitant, as though unsure whether permission included memory. Yes, he said. There was a woman, tall, dark gray coat. Asked for Amble's personal letters, but didn't stay long. Didn't give a name, but he remembered her. Spoke softly, like a lecturer. I asked if she'd touched anything. He said she'd read only one folder, quickly, then closed it and left. The folder, of course, was Uncollected Verse. Outside, Oxford was sliding into rain. Not the sort that drenches, but that quiet, persistent kind that seems to blur the edges of things. I walked beneath the dripping arches of the Western Quad and lit a cigarette I didn't finish. If Bexley had come here, and she had, it wasn't for poetry. Not really. She'd come to trace the past. Or erase it. The misattribution to Ronsard wasn't carelessness. It was camouflage. To place Amble's words in the mouth of a French poet was to push them beyond recognition and protect the link to C.F. Whoever she had been. Someone had lived once, briefly, in a single poem, then gone, then written herself back, with a name, and now she was dead. I thought again of the crossword. Lover, denied voice, silence, a clue, yes, but also a diagnosis. The cottage lay just beyond the ring road, flanked by hedgerows that seemed to lean inwards as if trying to overhear the past. It was a tired little place, the kind of house a man retreats to rather than inhabits. The curtains hung with the solemnity of robes once worn, now folded. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, not from a fire, but from books that had once burned in someone's imagination and never quite gone out. Dr. Ian Merrow answered the door with the look of someone expecting a worse visitor. Time had not been kind to him. Or perhaps it had merely been honest. He wore his regrets like another layer of skin. Visible in the curve of the shoulders, the slight sag around the mouth where hope had once rehearsed its lines. I declined tea. He didn't offer again. We sat in a study, so dimly lit, it seemed ashamed of itself. Books slumped on their sides, dust in thick, loyal coats. A photograph faced inward on the desk, frame cracked, the glass smudged with fingerprints that had never been wiped away. I asked about Frances Darnley. He exhaled, the kind of breath that carries not air, but memory. She was brilliant, he said, and completely unequipped for brilliance. She read too deeply, wrote too late into the night, questioned everything, including herself. He leaned back, eyes half-lidded. She was eaten alive. Morse, by intellect and shame, by being young in a place that never forgave you for showing how clever you were. And Catherine Finch? He smiled, without pleasure. A fiction, he said. A name passed around in those days like a flask of something forbidden. The girls made her up, I think. A persona, a kind of voice that could say what they couldn't. I asked who they were. Laura Bexley, for one. Frances, certainly. There may have been others, briefly, but those two, he trailed off. Well, they were something close to inseparable. At first, what happened? Something shattered them. He looked away. I wasn't told, but I heard things. He was quiet a moment longer. Then I think Frances believed she was in love. And Laura, well, Laura believed in control. He poured himself a whiskey without asking and drank it like water. I glanced around the room again. Nothing had been moved in years, except perhaps one drawer, slightly ajar, its contents not quite pushed back. I didn't open it. I already knew what I wouldn't find. I asked him if he'd read Harold Amble. He laughed, hoarse and thin. Amble? God, yes. Wrote like he was ashamed of being alive and desperate to prove he wasn't. But you know the type. I told him a line had surfaced in the Amble archive. She wrote his name, then burned the pen. Signed S. He closed his eyes, a tremor in his hand. The glass resting just a little harder on the table. Then she wasn't done, he said almost to himself. Who? Frances, or Catherine, or whoever she became when she left here. So she left. In pieces, he said. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the ivy on the window panes like a whisper, trying to get in. I thought about the woman in the bath, the elegant disarray, the missing luggage, the overwritten name. I thought too about the line. She wrote his name, then burned the pen. There was pain in it, not performance. Someone had tried to leave something behind, and then tried, just as desperately, to erase it. I no longer believed the woman in the bath was Catherine Finch. I wasn't even sure she had a name at all, not one that belonged wholly to her, but I was beginning to see the outlines of the triangle. Frances, Laura, and someone unnamed. A presence not in the rooms but in the silences between them. A reputation had been deferred, or borrowed, or buried. The question now was who had written the name, and who had burned the pen. The dean's drawing room was one of those high, pale spaces with too much light and not quite enough warmth. It overlooked the St. Hilda's gardens, all clipped lavender and overly dutiful roses, but the window stayed closed as though to keep out the season's creeping doubt. The tea was lapsang souchong over-brewed, the kind of choice that reveals more about character than taste. Dame Isabel Trevelyan greeted us with a precise nod and eyes that did not soften even when she smiled, a woman of impeccable posture and unapologetic intellect. She spoke the Queen's English with a faintly ironic detachment of someone who has mocked many men's essays and found most of them wanting. She remembered Frances Darnley. Very well, she said, and with sadness, not the theatrical sort, but something quieter, older, more difficult to place. She had, Trevelyan told us, a mind slightly ahead of itself, the kind that reads between lines that haven't been written yet. Very gifted, but too porous for this place. She paused to refill the pot, as though grief required a second steeping. I asked about the scandal. The word made her wince. There was, she explained, an anonymous essay submitted to the Bodleian Prize in 1987. Voices of Silence. The Women Who Burned the Word. A remarkable piece, she said. Radical, lyrical, deeply unsettling to certain male colleagues. It challenged the Academy's illusions, she added, with a thin smile. That's always the fastest route to professional exile. The problem wasn't the content. It was the question of authorship. Frances claimed it as hers. Trevelyan looked at me carefully, the way one might assess a fellow player across the chessboard. She never claimed it, Morse. Not in any formal sense, but Merrow and others suspected she'd submitted it under a pseudonym, or that someone else had done so on her behalf. There were accusations of plagiarism. Others whispered she had stolen the argument from someone else's research. Laura Bexley's name surfaced, briefly, and the essay, gone. Removed from the archive days after the competition. No record of who checked it out. No copy submitted. It vanished, like Frances. Not immediately. She stayed through the term, grew quiet. Then simply, stopped appearing. No formal withdrawal, just absence. Lewis shifted beside me, uncomfortable in these kinds of conversations, too much feeling where facts should be. I asked if Bexley had defended Frances. Yes, said Trevelyan. At first, publicly, eloquently. She gave a rather fierce speech about the voice of young women being stifled in academic structures. I remember it caused discomfort in the common room, and afterward, Bexley changed, or perhaps clarified. She distanced herself, quietly, thoroughly. The friendship ended, if that's what it had been. They were no longer seen together. Frances looked unmoored. The light went from her. Trevelyan said, then caught herself. That's too sentimental. But something essential dulled. It was difficult not to suspect jealousy, or something subtler. Frances had written something powerful, or was believed to have, and Bexley had been caught in its shadow. Academic environments reward proximity to brilliance. But not when brilliance burns unpredictably. It becomes inconvenient, and inconvenient women are swiftly rewritten. Trevelyan, watching me closely, said, I've always suspected that the essay's vanishing was less a theft than a silencing. A reputation deferred. A voice smothered beneath the clean white sheets of academic decency. Outside, the bell at Christ Church tolled once. A dry, indifferent sound. On our way out, I asked Lewis what he made of it. He shrugged. It's a lot of old ghosts, sir. Hard to say who did what. This far on. That's the trouble, I said. Ghosts have excellent memories, and some of them, it seems, had started to speak again. Or rather, to write. The page arrived folded inside a blank envelope, brought in by the guest house manager. Not the same woman who'd first called us, but another, younger, with the awkward professionalism of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. It had been found behind a wardrobe in the woman's room, she said, caught in the gap between wall and wood like something that hadn't wanted to be found but had grown tired of hiding. It was scorched at the edges, but the middle remained intact, a careful kind of damage, like a memory partially rehearsed and then abruptly suppressed. I watched her take it. The poem, the voice. Then she buried me alive in silence. No signature. Just those words. Not accusation, not quite confession. Something in between, the voice of someone who had lost something permanent and couldn't decide whether to mourn it or avenge it. I sat with it for longer than I should have, letting the language settle. The rhythm was familiar. Not in style, but in hurt. A voice I felt I already knew. Meanwhile, Lewis had been busy with the practical world. The plumbing. He'd followed up on something I'd idly remarked about the bath tap. A simple thing, barely noticed. The handle, it turns out, had been recently replaced. New metal on an old fixture. Poorly fitted. The plumber confirmed it had snapped sheared clean through and had been fixed 2 days before the body was found. The day of her death. It changed the tone of the room. Before, the bath had seemed a ritual, a solitary, quiet ending. But now, with the faulty tap, something darker suggested itself. She hadn't drawn the bath. It had been drawn for her, and the broken handle meant she couldn't stop it. The sound would have been constant, maddening, as she lay dying. A final, cruel soundtrack. The possibility of staging began to emerge, subtle, plausible, and all the more chilling for it. I returned to the suspects. Not for their alibis, but for their pauses. Guilt doesn't lie in what people say. It hides in how they hesitate when they've already answered. Dr. Merrow, when asked again about Francis Darnley, grew flustered, said he didn't see what more there was to say, repeated himself. That's always telling. Truth rarely needs rehearsal. And Bexley? She was colder now, as though she sensed the air tightening around her. I mentioned the diary page. She lifted an eyebrow. A tragic scrap, she said. Nothing more. Could have been written by anyone, about anything. But her mouth tightened when I read the words aloud. The poem. The voice. I asked if she recognized the phrasing. She claimed not to, but her hands, folded neatly in her lap, had begun to twitch at the knuckles, just once, like someone bracing for pain. Silence, I've found, is not a void. It's pressure. and she was feeling it now. Back at the station, I looked again at the photograph on her desk. The coastal path, the wind, the two women. It was an image meant to be innocent, but it had the stillness of an aftermath. Something had already happened. You could see it in the way they didn't quite lean toward each other. I thought again of the page. She buried me alive in silence. That wasn't metaphor, it was method. Someone had stolen, not just words, but the means to speak. And now, the woman in the bath, whoever she truly was, had tried to take that voice back. Whether she succeeded, I still didn't know. But I was certain now. She hadn't come to Oxford to die. She'd come to be heard, and someone had made sure she wasn't. Dr. Miro answered the door in shirt sleeves and slippers, a cigarette already dying between his fingers, as though he'd anticipated the interruption. The sky behind him was that brittle grey Oxford wears before a storm, when the light grows insistent, but empty. He didn't ask why I'd come. He simply led me to the study and poured 2 whiskies, one for each of us, but only one touched. The books had not moved since my last visit, though now there was a sheet of music left open on the desk. Purcell, I think, the kind of composer who leaves things unresolved. I told him about the diary page, the bath tap, the silence, and then, slowly, about the theft. France's lost essay, the vanished voice, the name that kept returning. He didn't interrupt, just stared at the base of his glass, like something lived there he hadn't yet dared to meet. When he finally spoke, his voice was thinner than I remembered. "It was me," he said. "Catherine Finch. After I retired, I used the name, wrote under it. Poems. A few essays. Nothing important." "Why?" I asked. He laughed, low and humorless. A borrowed name carries no expectation, and she'd been gone a long time. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that the name deserved to live, if not the girl. "But she returned," I said. He nodded. "Yes, 3 weeks ago, she came to the house. Same voice. Different face. Older, but unmistakable. Said she knew. That I'd taken her words, her name, her breath. She didn't shout. That was the worst of it. Just stood in the hallway, quietly disappointed. 'What did you say?' I said I was sorry. And then, she left. Nothing more. You didn't follow her. What would I have said? That I'd done it for her? That would have been a lie. I did it for the ease of anonymity. For the indulgence of being admired without being seen." I studied him. His voice, yes, was lined with remorse, but it was tidy remorse. The kind that has had time to iron its creases. "You never saw her again." "Never," he said. "Though she's been here ever since. In the walls. In the bloody typewriter. In the sound the kettle makes when it boils too long." It was a compelling confession. It fit. Neatly. Perhaps too neatly. Back at the station, I pulled the old journal article from the file. The 1987 poem submitted to the Bastion Review. The byline Catherine Finch. With an E. It wasn't a name. It was a misprint. Or perhaps not. The variant struck me suddenly. Not just uncommon, but specific. I'd seen it recently. Somewhere peripheral. Not in the main body of evidence, but lingering at the edge, like a smudge on the lens. I flipped through my notes, then paused. The guest house register. There it was. The woman had signed in as Catherine Finch. The same spelling, not an alias, a continuation. Not stolen, but reclaimed. A variation only the originator would use. Subtle, personal, deliberate, which meant Mero was lying. Or mistaken. Or confessing to a truth he had not earned. He had taken the name, yes, but he had not created it, nor did he truly own the guilt he tried to wear like sackcloth. The woman had come back, not to confront him but to recover something. A voice, a self, a silence, turned outward, and someone, not Mero, had stopped her. I closed the file and looked out across the city, where the rooftops shimmered with the sheen of approaching rain. I had been led to a solution, carefully constructed, emotionally plausible, but false. And somewhere, in the fogged recesses of memory, a single image now stirred. A hotel register, a photograph, a signature I had not noticed then but could no longer ignore. I wasn't at the end. I was at the brink. And behind me the story was beginning again. The register lay in its usual place, the leather now cracked at the binding, the pages foxed and faintly curling at the edges. It had been dusted since my last visit, but lightly, the sort of dusting that is more ceremonial than useful. I asked for it quietly, and the woman at the desk, the elder of the two receptionists, with a voice like a door just beginning to stick, handed it over without question. There it was again. Catherine Finch, slanting, elegant, almost apologetic handwriting. The kind of cursive they stopped teaching in schools decades ago. A relic in ink. It was the F that struck me most. Not flourished, but uncertain, like the writer had hesitated between strength and retreat. You could see the hand shaking slightly in the tail. No modern student would write like that. Certainly not one raised in the age of laptops and limp biro scrolls. No, this script belonged to another time. A quieter time. One with rooms left undisturbed for years and thoughts never quite finished aloud. The housemaid, the younger one, with the sallow complexion and the faint smell of lavender in her cardigan, lingered behind the desk, pretending to sort keys. I asked if she remembered the guest. She hesitated, as though checking some internal code about what should and shouldn't be said. Then she looked up. She seemed nervous, she said. Asked for extra towels twice. The second time, she was already wet. I thought it odd that she was polite about it, said she was sorry for dripping. Did she mention her name? Only said she was traveling alone, but she didn't look like she believed it. I nodded, thanked her, left the building quietly. The rain had begun by the time I reached the Eagle and Child, what the undergraduates called the Bird and Baby. The wooden booths were nearly empty, and the barmaid gave me the pint without asking for payment. I must have looked older than I felt. I sat in the back corner, as I used to years ago before the world grew too loud. The diary page was in my coat, folded and faded. I unfolded it now, and read it again. I watched her take it. The poem, the voice. Then she buried me alive in silence. For the first time, I saw it not as metaphor, but as record. Not a flourish of grief, but an observation. I pictured not a theft, but a moment. A woman standing in a room, watching another carry her voice away word by word. And then it came. The scar. It had been faint. So faint, I had dismissed it. A pale thread just above the wrist, visible only under the harsh bathroom light. The kind of mark left by a failed attempt or an institution's restraint. Laura Bexley had a sister. I'd read it somewhere. A footnote in an old personnel file. Vivienne Bexley. Studied briefly at St. Hilda's. Left after a breakdown in Aix-en-Provence. Presumed dead. No obituary. No details. But what if she hadn't died? What if she had returned under another name? Her sister's invention, perhaps. Catherine Finch. A name designed to protect, to contain, to keep the world at arm's length. And what if something had broken through? I left the pub without finishing the pint. The rain had gathered force, blurring the stone beneath my feet. As I crossed Radcliffe Square, the spires disappeared into mist, and the old dome of the camera looked less like a building than a thought suspended in weather. St. Hilda's loomed ahead, soft lit and watchful. I quickened my pace. Vivienne hadn't been seeking revenge. She'd been seeking identity. Her voice had been stolen, reshaped, published, erased, until she returned not to punish but to remember. But someone hadn't allowed that remembering. Someone had preferred silence. I reached the college gate and rang the bell. Inside, a secret waited, and this time I intended to hear it. The lamp above the porter's gate cast a buttery glow over the paving stones as I waited. Rain had thinned to mist, clinging like breath on glass. Beyond the arch, St. Hilda's lay muffled and expectant, as though holding in its throat a final note of some long-forgotten madrigal. I gave my name, and the porter, blinking too often as if woken from some difficult dream, led me to the fellow's library. She was already there. Laura Bexley, sitting alone, upright, hands folded on the long oak table, as if awaiting a viva. Her hair had been pinned, though one strand had fallen loose and now hovered like a question over her temple. A decanter stood untouched beside her. 2 glasses laid out like props in a well-rehearsed scene. The library smelled of paper, polish, and something older like salt caught in old stone. The shelves seemed to lean inward, not menacing, but attentive, as though they'd seen this moment coming for years. I closed the door behind me. She didn't ask why I had come. Her eyes, sharp, despite the weariness, held mine for a breath longer than comfort allowed. Then she gestured, gently, precisely to the chair opposite. "So, you've remembered," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Vivienne," I said. Her mouth twisted, briefly, almost fondly. "She was brilliant once, you know. Before everything broke. I suppose I should be grateful no one else remembered that." "They will now," I said. "They must." She laughed quietly. The sound of someone who had once rehearsed tragedy and now only observed it. "Frances wrote that essay," she said. "Not me. I found it after she'd left. I was young, ambitious. I thought if I made it beautiful, if I gave it light, perhaps it didn't matter. No one would know. But Vivienne did. Eventually, she read it somewhere. Recognized her voice. She always had an ear for tone. And she came back. She came back with a name. Catherine Finch. Her own invention. Poetic, obscure, entirely her. I should have stopped her then, but I didn't. I let her stay at the guest house, paid in cash. I thought it would burn out quietly, but she didn't let it. She wanted a retraction, an apology, a name in print, next to mine, reclaiming what I'd taken. She wrote to the college, the press, even the archive. There would have been inquiries, questions I couldn't answer without tearing down everything I'd built. She didn't threaten you, only with memory. That was always her weapon. The past, sharpened to a point, and the bath. She closed her eyes. She was already half gone. The medication. She took it willingly. I added nothing, only ensured she wouldn't leave. The tap, yes. I broke it, fixed it so it couldn't be turned off. She didn't struggle. I think in the end she forgave me. That was the cruelest part. You didn't mean to kill her. I meant to stop the past. But the past, it seems, is an excellent swimmer. Outside, the rain began again in earnest, drumming faintly against the high windows. Somewhere above, the bell in the dining hall struck the hour, 8 or 9. I forget which. I told her we'd need to leave, that she'd be formally charged. She nodded. No protest. Only a long glance around the room, as though saying farewell to something invisible. She asked if she could take the book with her. Les Amours de Cassandre. I told her no. That it would be evident. Then take this, she said, and pushed the library card across the table. Her signature on it was dated nearly 3 weeks ago. Next to it, a second name, barely legible in old ink, Vivienne Bexley. I held the card a moment longer than necessary. Then I rose. She followed without sound. Outside, the sky had cleared again. Not fully, but just enough to reveal a single star above the chapel spire. Faint, obstinate, alone. In silence, we walked toward the gate. Past the cloisters, past the long shadowed windows, past the echo of voices that had once spoken more clearly. Sometimes I think justice is not a verdict, but a kind of listening. And that evening in the quiet of the stone I heard something begin to forgive. The quad was empty by the time I returned to the Bodleian. Rain had passed some hours earlier, and its residue glistened on the flagstones like old varnish. The light was Oxford light, that peculiar mix of gold and bone that turns every corner into a memory. The air smelled faintly of ink, and something deeper beneath it, Parchment, perhaps, or sorrow long folded. I didn't ask permission. I knew the archive well enough by now. The attendant, a younger man with a kind face and no interest in small talk, merely nodded and gestured to the Harold Amble papers. The box was where I had left, neatly bound in grey cloth, its spine creased by time and too many hands. I didn't come to read. Not this time. I'd brought with me a letter, unsigned, unsent, and unsendable. Written in my own hand, quietly, the night before, with no intention beyond the act itself. It began, "Francis, or whatever name the world forgot to give you. I don't know where you were buried. I don't know who said the words, if any were said at all. But I've seen the silence you left behind, and it's louder than anything they published under their own names." The rest was more muddled. Something about voices and vanishing, about the cruelty of intelligent women being outlived by lesser men. It was not a good letter. But it was, I suppose, honest. I tucked it beneath Les Amours de Cassandre, nestled among Amble's lesser-known drafts, the poems that never reached print, the ones left untitled. I sealed the folder, closed the box. No ceremony, just a small, imperfect act. As I stepped out into the quad, the bells from St. Mary's were sounding 6, not the insistent clang of noon, but the more reflective chime of evening. The hour when regret is loudest. I wandered, as one does in Oxford, without intent, past the Radcliffe Camera, its dome pale against the darkening blue, past Brasenose Lane where the air always smells of stone and shadow, and finally down St. Giles, toward the Burden baby. Lewis was already at the bar. He looked surprised to see me. Not because I was late. I hadn't said I'd come, but because I was there at all. He lifted a pint, half raised it toward me. I shook my head, half smiling. "Not tonight," I said. "Some thirsts are never quite quenched." He nodded. No protest. He's learned that silence is sometimes a full sentence. We sat by the window where the candlelight trembled against the glass. Outside, students passed in 2s and 3s, laughing in that careless way only the young can afford. Inside, the wood paneling absorbed the years, as it always had. Lewis asked, after a while, what I thought would happen to Bexley. "She'll be remembered," I said, "but not for what she wrote." "And Vivienne?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Instead, I watched the dusk settle across the street, a soft layering of time upon time, and in it, I imagined her. Not as she had been in the bath, pale and drowned, but younger, sharper, on that windswept path by the sea, standing beside Francis and Laura, all three caught mid-laugh, before betrayal, before the erasures. There are names we write once, and never again, but there are also names we whisper, even when no one is left to hear. That night, Oxford folded around me, as it always does, not cruelly but with the slow patience of a city that seemed too much to ever forget. And somewhere, above the dreaming spires, the bells tolled on.